Christ is everything. And as a follower of Jesus Christ, He comes in on the inside of us to make a total life makeover. In other words, He wants to change absolutely everything about us. And that's who we are in relation to a follower of Christ. We have a new identity. And Paul is writing about that in this little letter that we're studying. He's talking about the supremacy and the sufficiency of Jesus Christ and how important it is for us to embrace our identity in Him. But inside of that, he's also addressing the problems that can really attack us. And well, what is the biggest enemy to our identity? It's our flesh. Remember, the flesh is the roadmap that leads us back into sin. So there's two basic kingdoms that really do influence and strengthen our flesh. It's the kingdom of darkness, which would be living in rebellion to the Lord, living completely for ourselves. And then also the kingdom of self-righteousness. In other words, we can put together a list of things that we can do that we think is going to bring us into favor with God or make us righteous before the Lord or give us strength to live for Him. And both of those really lead us to our flesh. Why is that? Because both of them say this: I do not need Christ. So Paul is addressing that in this little letter. And then as he's doing that and he's talking about the flesh, he begins to transition from that into dealing specifically with the flesh. In chapter 3 and verse 5, he says this: Mortify therefore your members. In other words, put to death your members which are upon the earth. He's talking about your flesh. Paul is making this very clear. If we are going to be strong in the Lord, if we're going to embrace our identity in Christ, we have to deal with our flesh. And he begins to list the things that they were before they were in Christ, like fornication or sexual immorality, and uncleanness, which is impurity, and inordinate affection, which is this concept of evil passions and the wrong kind of passions, evil concupiscence and covetousness. In other words, this evil desire and covetousness, which is idolatry. Paul is making it clear. You have to deal with your flesh. And once you begin to do that, and until you do that as a believer, you're never going to be able to embrace your identity in Christ. That's why he tells us in other places in his writings to walk in the Spirit, so that you won't fulfill the lust of the flesh, these old things that you used to do. And then he begins in that same chapter to transition into something I think is very interesting. It's a very common thing for them in that day and us as well. And that is a garment. We all put on garments and we take off garments. And Paul makes this kind of transitions into that kind of language. And in verse 8 he says this: But now that we understand who we are in Christ, now that we understand how significant and devastating the flesh is in relation to that, now put off all of these. He starts saying, using this language of a garment. Now that's a lot different, obviously, for us than it was them, because they probably only had a couple of garments, maybe 3 at the most, or 4, depends on how wealthy they were. So changing a garment, when he begins to talk about this, would have been very significant. I mean, we change garments all the time. We have clothes for all different kinds of occasions. So for us, it's maybe not as a significant concept, but for them it would have been. Now notice why he's saying that. See, so what does that have to do, the garment have to do with our identity in Christ? Everything. Because he's saying your garment, that like he's talking about here as far as who you are in Christ, is going to allow you to have the ability to reflect Christ in the right way. So the things that don't reflect Christ, we've got to remove those. So he begins to name them. Here's what they are. Listen to this list: anger, wrath, malice. You ever dealt with any of those? Those are certainly some difficult things. He said, that's not reflecting Christ. That's actually something that's reflecting who you were before you knew the Lord. And he says, slander or blasphemy, filthy communication. In other words, obscene language. And then he goes on to say this: do not lie. Lie not one to another, seeing that you have put off the old man with his deeds. He's saying this: we need to put off, like we would a garment, we need to put off these things that we were before Christ. And when we understand what that means, then we're able to put on what we would say is the new garment. Being able to remove the old things that would hinder our ability to reflect Christ and put on the right things. So what is he doing? And what is he saying? He's saying this: that if our identity in Christ is strong, it's going to completely control how we act and live. And to do that, it requires a separation. A separation from what? The kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of self-righteousness. So we have to not just embrace our identity in Christ, we have to submit to Him in a way so that He can change absolutely everything about us. Why? So that the practical living out of our faith will reflect the very person of Jesus Christ. So as Paul's using this language in relation to clothing, that's just so interesting. Put these things on, and then let's put these other things on. So if we're going to be that, if we're going to do that, we're going to have to be obedient to the teachings of this little letter. And so how do we do that? We do that by completely submitting ourselves to the person of Jesus Christ and saying this: my identity is in Him completely. And it truly affects who I am and changes everything that I do. So that as I live my life, I'm living with the concept in mind that I am reflecting Christ when I walk into school, when I go into my workplace, when I'm in my neighborhood. Whatever I'm doing in my life, my purpose in life is to reflect Christ, and that truly is my identity. And it will only be done through the power of Christ as He transforms you and as He transforms me.